He's a very good guy.
Good morning and welcome. My name is John McQuiston from ABC7. It is fitting we have a forum about taxes in 2013, since it was 100 years ago in 1913 that the 16th Amendment passed that allowed the federal government to collect federal income tax for the first time. We have a distinguished panel of experts, as well as Congressman Vern Buchanan, Florida's only member of the powerful U.S. House Ways and Means Committee, which is reviewing the current federal tax law. We have, closest to me, Neil Bortz, a former nationally syndicated radio talk show host who co-wrote the Fair Tax book with Congressman John Linder. And the book calls for the replacement of the income tax with a consumption tax. Dan Mitchell is a senior fellow with the Cato Institute, which is a public policy research organization dedicated to the principles of individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace. Mitchell is an expert on tax reform and a strong advocate of the flat tax. Then, of course, in the middle is Congressman Buchanan. Next to him is Susan Nylund, the general manager of WSRQ Radio in Sarasota, a radio show host and writer who advocates a progressive tax that taxes wealthy people at higher rates than low-income individuals. And at the end, last but not least, Jerry Pierce is the Florida chairman of the National Federation of Independent Businesses, or the NFIB, which is the leading small business association representing small and independent businesses. The NFIB supports modifications to provide tax relief and certainty to small businesses. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin first with Congressman Buchanan, then each of the panelists will have 5 minutes to just deliver opening statements, and then we'll begin with questions. If you had questions, what we're going to do, just to make it simpler, is that I'm going to read them. So as you came in, you should have been able to fill out a questionnaire. So if you have a question and didn't fill out one of these, if you can see someone in the back there, they'll get your question up to me so that I can ask it to the panel. And with that, we'll begin with Congressman Buchanan.
We're going to come up there or stay here?
You can speak right at your microphone right there. You'll be fine there.
Well, thank you first, John. I want to thank you and ABC7 locally for doing this. Also, I'd like to thank our audience and our guests today. Tax day's coming up in a few days, the next 15 days or so. As many of you know, I'm the only member on the Ways and Means Committee. It's the Tax Committee. Our chairman, Dave Camp, his focus is trying to do tax reform. I did have an opportunity about a week or so ago to talk with the president. He's open-minded to tax reform, so it's something we think there's a window of opportunity in the next six months or so. Also, I'd just like to say I want to thank our panelists here for taking their time and effort for being here today, because it's really important that we put everything on the table. That's kind of what the chairman's thought. My thoughts are, let's be open-minded, look at all the current taxing systems as well as other tax systems as well. Our tax code since 1986, it's been the same way for the last 20-some years, so it's important that we take a look at what's going on not just here, but around the world. We also, as many of you know, I was looking at the other day, if you get an iPad today, it's one page to fill out your tax form for a small business or an individual 1040. It's over 100 pages. The tax code itself is 73,000 pages. My focus on, one of my big focuses on, is I've been asked to kind of chair the working group, which is small, medium-sized businesses and what we call pass-through entities. And I want to find a way that we can help our small businesses be more successful. And one of the ways to do that is address what's happening in terms of the tax code, ideally to make it simpler, but also look at all these various taxing systems, because we need to create more jobs. We're only growing at less than 2%. We need to grow at 4 or 5%. One of the ways we can do that is through our tax code. Thank you, John.
All right, Congressman. Why don't we go next to Jerry Pierce from the NFIB.
Thank you very much. I'm Jerry Pierce. I am a small business owner in Orlando with a company with about 35 employees in the restaurant equipment business. I have the honor of representing NFIB as a non-paid leader of the group for small businesses for the state of Florida. I try to stay out of my business, and as long as I do, the kids seem to do very well running it. In terms of the issue today for taxes, our tax code right now is 73,608 pages. My own personal tax form came out to well over 150 pages, and I can't tell you what's in it. I really don't understand it. I have to turn it over to accountants, similar to what 90% of the small businesses do when we took a recent survey. In terms of this tax structure right now for small businesses, with the basic rate being raised, or the high-end rate, to 39.6%, and then you add the various FICA taxes and Medicare taxes, you're at 54.9%, and that doesn't include investment taxes and other things that get added on to that. But the interesting thing is there's been a lot of discussion in our country about the top 1% and vilifying people in the top 1%. Approximately 60% of that top 1% are small business owners who are in effect pass-through entities. And the interesting thing is that at what was the top 35% rate, the average amount of taxes that the top 1% has paid is only 16.9%, which means a vast majority or number of the people in the top 1% are paying nothing or next to nothing in taxes. For major corporations, we hear about the high tax rate of 35%. However, the actual real tax rate at the end of the day that major corporations are paying are 13%. So out of this, what that really means is that there's all kinds of tax preferences, set-asides, deductions, et cetera, that a very high percentage of the people can take advantage of, and many people cannot take advantage of. And so that really points to a major redo of the tax code so that it's a level playing field and that it's fair and eventually will help our economy grow. Those are my opening comments. I could keep going more if you'd like, but I think I ought to stop and wait for somebody else.
Jerry, thank you. Next, we'll go to Susan Nylund.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Nylund. As indicated, I'm an owner of WSRQ Radio, but I don't get up every day and look at myself as that. I look at myself as a small business owner. And because just like much of the gentlemen up here, my concern isn't, what the product that we put out, but how we make our payroll, how I pay my taxes. And, from the little bit of time I've gotten to know everybody up here, we've discussed the commonality of our principle that we have to elicit change, because what we have right now is not working. When I have to spend a whole weekend putting together all my taxes and then hand them over to somebody else and hope that that person I've chosen actually knows more than I do about my taxes, I immediately identify that there is something wrong with the system. When I have, as a small business owner, have to pay my taxes, whether it's quarterly or monthly, and I'm struggling to make payroll, and yet so I reach for my credit card to pay for my taxes, there's something wrong with that system. However, they asked me to represent the progressive tax. And through this thought process over the past couple of weeks, I've taken a look at what the progressive tax system is and where it started. And with the ideology that we put forth, measurable interest in what we can afford. So it is a system that allows someone at my level of income or lower to essentially pay the same thing as someone at a higher level of income, because it's what we can afford to put through. However, when you look at the original system of the progressive tax, and the taxation that it replaced was the flat tax, it was replaced for the flat tax for a reason, because the flat tax wasn't working. So we created this system back in the 1800s, and here we are 100 years or so later, and I look at it and it doesn't resemble anything of what we intended. You have, as Representative Buchanan pointed out, 70,000 pages of tax codes. When you have large corporations that they're every year they turn in 57,000 pages of their returns, there's something wrong with that. I look at it and I say, in principle philosophy, I believe in the progressive system. It absolutely makes sense, because I put forth what, and I know a few of them will challenge me on this because they've already done it. I put forth what I can afford. The more I make, I can afford to pay more, but I recognize that I could not have afforded to do it if our system wasn't in place. The advantages that were put forth to me, I feel I need to pay back, and there's enough people in the 1% who are in agreement, and I have to sit there and look and say, if they're in agreement that they should be taxed at a higher rate, then what's wrong? If I'm in a 32 percentile and they're in a 17 percentile tax rate, I look at it and I say, somewhere there's an advantage that they're able to take advantage to have that I'm not. When we talk about this, and we're going to have a lot of discussion about the fair tax, the flat tax, and the progressive tax, all I ask is that we take a look at, are we really talking about the same things? Are we talking about reform? I think we're all going to agree that we need reform. I think we all need to recognize that there are severe problems in our system. But I asked, do we throw that out? Do we throw out our system right now and say we're going to completely start all over again? And then you have to say, do you really believe that that's going to happen? Do you really believe that if we all vote on instilling any one of these other taxes, then we're going to turn them over into a government who created what we have today and say, but they're going to handle this better. They're going to be much more on the forefront of saying we're going to stick to the original plan. And I just have my doubts.
Susan, thank you. Next, Dan Mitchell.
Thank you very much. I sort of feel funny being up here in this debate, especially with my friend Neil here, because he's for the fair tax, I'm for the flat tax, but I've actually debated on C-SPAN in favor of the fair tax. I testified to Ways and Means way back in the 1990s on the fair tax. I like that plan a lot. As a matter of fact, I view the fair tax and the flat tax as just different sides of the same coin because they're both trying to achieve the same thing. Lower tax rates so you're not penalizing productive behavior. Get rid of all the double taxation of saving and investment because even Marxist and socialist, every economic theory in the world agrees that capital formation is the key to long-run growth. So why do we tax it over and over again between capital gains taxes, corporate income taxes, double taxes on dividends, death taxes? So you want to get rid of all that double taxation, and then you want to get rid of all the corruption, the loopholes, the shelters, the deductions, the exemptions, the credits, the exclusions in the tax code that give you those 73,000 pages. And if you do that, you wind up with what? You wind up with a low-rate, consumption-based tax. It can be a flat tax where you tax income one time at one low rate when you earn it, or it can be a fair tax where you tax income one time at one low rate when you spend it. But the key thing is, and I realize I'm talking like a boring economist here, you want to deal with those fundamental problems of penalizing, saving, investment, work, risk-taking, entrepreneurship. We live in a competitive global economy. We can't afford bad policy anymore unless we want to see the jobs going to China, unless we want to see the jobs going to India. We want to make America a tax haven. We don't want to make America a tax hell. And unfortunately, every year that the IRS code gets worse and more complicated, we're making our system more destructive to the kinds of behaviors that made us the greatest country on earth. And you look around the world, there are about 30 flat tax jurisdictions. Not all of them are pure flat taxes. They have their own quirks and everything. But the systems that are designed very well, like Hong Kong and Estonia, they're getting great results. We want long-run growth. We don't want to wind up like Europe. We don't want to wind up like Greece, Italy, and Spain. And I'll close with just one important warning about that. It is impossible to have a good tax system if you have an out-of-control entitlement state. And that's what we have right now, and we need to fix that. I'm very glad that the congressman and others have voted for the Ryan budget with good reforms in it to try to save us from that fate. If we allow government to consume 40, 50% of our GDP, no tax system will be good. On the other hand, if we do what our founding fathers envisioned, have a small central government in Washington, heck, for over 100 years, we didn't need either a fair tax or a flat tax because government was only consuming 3% of GDP. That, I think, is the vision we should be shooting for ultimately. So maybe, Neil, both of us are wrong. We should just have no broad-based tax whatsoever.
And with that, we will... You do wonder if a 16th Amendment could even happen these days, considering what the results have been. Now, Mr. Bortz.
Thanks a lot. I don't know where to start here, really. About 13 years ago, 12 years ago, 3 Houston businessmen put together, managed to raise about $22 million to spend on economist focus groups and everything for one purpose. Let's redo our tax code, come up with a better idea. And they came up with the fair tax. It got the fair tax because in a focus group one time, they were presenting their idea from these economists at MIT and Harvard and Chicago and elsewhere. They were presenting the idea, and somebody in the focus group said, well, that's a fair tax. Oh, hey, thanks for the name. It's called the fair tax. Now, right now, the progressive tax code we have
The first mention that I can find of the progressive tax code is in 1848. Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, a document called the Communist Manifesto. And they insisted in that book we must have a progressive income tax. They also insisted on government schools, but that's another item altogether. And the idea of, well, you really ought to pay what you can afford to pay came straight out of that document too. That's the old concept of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Very simply, the fair tax. Whatever you have on you, in your purse, your shoes, your ties, your clothes, those of you that are clothed, about 22% of the cost of every possession you have represents the taxes that were paid by all of the people who brought that consumer item to you, from the cotton farmer to the trucker to the retailer, all of them, about 22%. You pay $1 for an item, about 22% of that represents the taxes all these people have paid to the federal government. Let's get rid of that, all of it. Let's remove the embedded taxes. How do you do that? You get rid of the income tax, personal income tax, corporate income tax. You get rid of all payroll taxes, the estate tax, capital gains taxes, they're gone. Gift taxes, they're gone. Alternative minimum tax, Social Security tax, Medicare tax. You get rid of them all. And then when somebody goes and gets a job that pays $1,000 a week, every 2 weeks they get a check for $2,000. You get 100% of your paycheck. You have no tax paperwork. You file no tax return. But where does the government get their money? Well, you know that 22 cents that came out of the price of everything you buy? They add a consumer sales tax right back in. It's 23% in order to fund the government at its present level. So a $100 toaster now, $22 of that toaster has gone to the federal government, all of those embedded taxes. That's gone. Then you buy the toaster for $100 now, maybe it cost $101 because of 23%. It'll say toaster, $77 on the receipt. Toaster, $77. Fair tax, $23. You're paying the same $100. You're getting 100% of your paycheck. One more thing. Under the fair tax, nobody pays any taxes to the federal government until you've taken care of the needs of your family. Not a penny to the federal government until your family's needs are taken care of. If you're a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, I have the latest figures are right here. The Health and Human Services has determined that a family of 4 has to spend, if the fair tax were in effect, they would pay $595 a month in fair tax on the items they need to provide for their family basic necessities. So at the beginning of that month, they get a check, or they get a credit to a debit card, or they get money direct deposited into their bank account. But they get that $595. So they know that they can go through that month, buy all the basic necessities for their family, food, clothing, shelter, transportation, get the basic necessities. Only after they've spent that money will they actually start paying taxes to the government in the fair tax, because everything they paid up to that point has been prebated to them. Rebate, paid ahead, prebate. Now, one more thing I want to mention to you. Imagine if you're a small businessman, if you operated with no tax component on capital or labor. You could start a business, you didn't have to hire an accountant to handle the taxes, because there aren't any. You just take your money and you spend it on growing your business. A couple of years back, they approached 400 chief financial officers of major corporations not headquartered in the United States. And they laid out the fair tax to these people, and they said, now what would you do? What would your economic decisions be in your company if the fair tax were law in the United States? And about 60% of these people said, well, our next capital investment, distribution center, manufacturing center, whatever, would be in the United States. We'd take advantage of that immediately. Well, why wouldn't the other 40% locate their next feature in the United States? Well, that's because their answer was, we would move our headquarters to the United States, where we could operate our businesses with no tax component on capital and labor. The fair tax goes into effect, and you have to hide under one of these auditorium seats to avoid getting a good job. And one more thing, why, if it's such a great idea, why hasn't it been passed? It would be the biggest transfer of power from government to the people in the history of our republic. And present company excluded, of course, most of those people in Washington are not interested in transferring power to you. They're interested in wielding power over you. If the fair tax is ever done, it's going to be done by the people, figuratively carrying pitchforks and torches and marching on Washington. And to answer the question, do you really think that would happen? Throughout the entirety of the American Revolutionary War from 1776 to 1783, the majority of the colonists were against independence from Great Britain. And those who were fighting for freedom, maybe they stood around too and said, do you really think this can happen? And it did.
I know you want to jump in, Congressman. And
That was for all of us, right?
it seems that we have unanimity among the panelists that the current system needs to be fixed or replaced. But all of those loopholes, all of those pages in the tax documents, they all have constituencies. They all have people who benefit from them somehow. I just wonder, how could any meaningful reform happen? And then I'll let you also say what you wanted to say, Congressman.
Let me just say, why I'm so anxious about the idea of doing tax reform. I just had the opportunity, I'm on the subcommittee for trade, I was in Beijing, met with the Minister of Trade and met with the Vice Premier. Their focus for the next 5 to 7 years, in 2 separate meetings, they told me the same thing. They want to create 20 million jobs a year for the next 7 years. That's what they've been averaging in China creating. Sandy and I were there in the late 80s. They were a non-factor. They're a factor today. Now, why is that so important? Because the people that are the job creators, that maybe have 100 employees in this town or other towns, if they're paying 50% in taxes, that they've got to get out. If they make $500,000 or $1 million, they have to pay out $500,000. Then they've got to also take care of bank covenants and everything else. How do we compete with these companies, other competitors around the world? The second thing, I'll just add to that quickly, and talking with Hong Kong last year, they had a flat tax for many years of 20%. They just lowered it to 16. I said, I thought 20% was pretty fair. This is one of the ministers there. He said, well, we have to be competitive. The world has changed. We've got to do everything we can to empower our small businesses, medium-sized businesses, our pass-through entities to make sure that they can compete, not just here, but in the world. So I just want to say that and let someone else can take the other question if you want to repeat the question.
Okay, well, I was just curious about how, with all these loopholes and everyone has a constituency, and it's a way for people in government to actually trade favors to people. How could you give your fellow congressmen, or get them to give up that power they have?
Well, let me just tell you that when we're talking in Washington about maybe shutting down some loopholes and looking at all these loopholes, we've had every special interest group and from K Street and everybody up in our office. But we're putting everything on the table. We're looking to, ideally, part of the thought is, and that's why I want to get their thoughts, is kind of lowering the overall rate. Even the president has mentioned on corporate rates, we're the highest rate in the world, maybe down to 25. But the idea is that we're going to have to take a look at these and make a lot of hard decisions if we're going to lower the overall rate, because someone mentioned corporations, big corporations are effectively paying 13. I've heard 17%. I don't know what it is, but they're not paying 35. So to work on this, we've got to do it in a way, on a bipartisan basis, that's going to make sense.
Neil Boris.
Congressman, can I pretend that you're not here for a second? Would that be okay? Corporations do not pay taxes, period. They collect them from shareholders, employees, and customers and pass them on to the government. Now, how can we get Congress to pass meaningful tax reform? Answer, they're not going to do it. Their ability to provide favors to favored constituencies, sometimes in exchange for some pretty nifty little tax breaks. There's a ceiling fan company out there that gets a tax break on a specific model of ceiling fan. How do you think that happened? So they're not going to do it. It's only going to be done when we fill up auditoriums like this and have people standing in the hallways. And then, as the Yamamoto said, when they walk out, they are filled with a terrible resolve that they are going to make sure that we get the tax reform we need in this country, or there's going to be congressmen who are going to be boning up on their resumes. Congress isn't going to do it. You have to do it. You are the only people that can get this done.
Many, many years ago, I worked for Senator Bob Packwood, who used to be the chairman of the Finance Committee and was part of the whole 1986 Tax Reform Act. So I do think there's something to the notion that it's actually easier to do big tax reform, because if you're not just going after one loophole, if you're going after all of them and trying to rewrite the tax system, I think then that changes the dynamic. And the other thing that I think changes the dynamic, and this didn't exist back in '86, but it does today, and it ties into what the congressman was saying, it is so much more of a competitive global economy today. We can't afford the class warfare stuff anymore, because the only effective class warfare is that we drive the jobs and the capital overseas. And I think that's different today. And I'm delighted if we get a fair tax. I'm delighted if we get a flat tax. I just want to get rid of the current system. And I think we need to harness the power of competition and the power of fundamental reform to try to help push this over the finish line, along with, of course, those pitchforks and torches.
I know Susan and Jerry want to jump in. Let's go to Susan next. What do you?
I guess, we've been talking about this for a really long time, and I frankly am really getting tired of the tax conversation always focused on the top 1%, the corporations, the General Electrics, the argument of the only reason our industry is overseas is because of our tax system, when the bottom line is it's just not true. That's just only one part of the decision-making process. But when I go into work every day, I'm not concerned about how General Electric is going to survive. We've done really well by them. They have worked out a system through what we provided with, not only to not pay any tax over a certain amount, but we feed them with government funding. We feed them with military contracts. They have worked out really, really well, and General Electric isn't looking to leave the country. I care about what I face every day, and I care about my tax burden, and I'm of the middle class. I also care about the individual. Neil is quick to point out that, it's going to be fair because we're going to send you a check every month. Well, let me tell you something. There are quite often that, in fact, there's a large part of the economy that can't wait until the end of the month to get their check. They have to, that toaster that's $100, they have to make it till the end of the month to see whether they can afford it. Chances are they've built up so much debt that when they finally get that check, it's not going to what it was supposed to go to. My attitude is, why tax them at all if that's the case, if we're really concerned about them? I'm also looking at the fact that conversations are always to the people who can afford to do these things, because we're so in fear of losing that opportunity. I don't believe that businesses make bad decisions for themselves. I don't believe that they're going to stop working after they get to a certain tax threshold. It just doesn't make sense. It's not what we built up. And you're right, you brought up something else as well. The idea that we have a system that feeds off of that. You're right, every Every congressman has a constituent. Boeing is a perfect example. The military is buying from Boeing things that we just don't need anymore. Well, why is that? Because Boeing employs an incredible amount of people in that congressman's town, and it's going to directly affect the economy. We have a bad system, but we're not arguing over whether a progressive tax is better than the fair tax or the flat tax. We're just arguing that that it's not working. And it's not working because we've created this monster that we're addicted to. And I just don't see, even if you take that implementation and spoon feed it into the economy, or you just do what was suggested and stop it altogether and just implement this tax, it's not going to work because we can't help ourselves anymore.
The prebate for the amount of fair tax that a family of 4 or 3 or 8 or whatever would spend in a month is paid at the beginning of the month, not at the end. Nobody has to wait for that money. And by the way, if you work in this country at the minimum wage, under the fair tax, your actual effective tax rate for the year would be a negative 23%. At $31,000 a year, your effective tax rate would be 0%. The poor in this country, and boy, do they hate it when you point out that the rich keep getting richer because they keep doing whatever it was that made them rich. Ditto for the poor. But the poor in this country would make out like bandits under the fair tax, with most of them having absolutely no tax rate, no tax liability at all, while getting 100% of their paychecks.
I know Jerry had a thought he wanted to add, and I had a question for him as well before, and you can add your thought as well. But if you could set aside the complexity of the current system, does by itself a progressive tax hurt small businesses, and how so?
Well, any tax system, progressive or otherwise, compared to what we have now, as long as we get rid of all the loopholes and all the set-asides, would be much significantly better. I personally prefer the fair tax because it removes the cost of employing a person to make us more competitive on a worldwide market. And the more items that we have of taxes, fees, insurance items, healthcare, et cetera, put into the cost of hiring somebody, the less competitive we become across the world. So if we can put all those things into a fair tax, now this is not a position of the Nfib, because unless we have 70% of our members agreeing in one direction or another, we do not have a formal position on it, although we may at some point. The latest surveys aren't showing it to be one way or another.
I know for the flat tax idea has been around, and as Susan mentioned, it used to be the way we tax things, and it seems to be widely popular across the country that we do have a progressive tax. And I did want to ask Dan how politically you get a flat tax in place, and how to convince people who are at the bottom of that that the wealthiest shouldn't pay a greater percentage than the poorest.
We've had 2 flat taxes in our history. The Civil War tax of 1862, I think it was a flat tax that was repealed in 1872. We then had a flat tax in 1894, but the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional, any income tax being unconstitutional in 1895. We then, of course, got the 16th Amendment in 1913, a dark day in American history. That started out as a progressive tax with a top rate of 7%. It very quickly, of course, morphed into the monster that we have today. How do we get it back? Well, this is where I agree fully with Neil. Whatever tax reform that we're going to get, we're only going to get it because the American people, perhaps combined with the pressure of global competition, is going to force politicians to do it, even though many of them instinctively don't want to do it, because it does mean that they lose a lot of their power over the economy. And I'll give you one anecdote about that. Over the years, I've given, I'm sure, hundreds of speeches about the flat tax. I've gone to the National Association of Realtors and the National Association of Home Builder conventions and talked about the home mortgage interest deduction, and I got friendly, skeptical, but friendly reception. I spoke to the American Opera Association once, and of course they depend on high-dollar gifts. And we're going to lose the charitable contributions deduction. I went through the data with them, friendly, a little bit skeptical reception. The nastiest, most hostile reception I ever got and I actually thought it would be a friendly reception, shows how naive I can be sometimes, is when I spoke to a bunch of tax lobbyists for Fortune 100 corporations. I thought I was going to be the hero. I was going to go in and talk about, we're going to have full expensing instead of depreciation. We're going to have a territorial tax system. We're going to have a low corporate tax rate. I figured they'd put me on their shoulders and march me out like I had won a national championship. All these people hated me. Why? Because they probably had an average income in that room of more than $1 million a year each, and I was going to take away the source of their human capital that was enabling them to earn those high salaries. They want the system. These are the guys working for Boeing and General Electric that you're talking about. They want the current system complicated. It's not just politicians. Washington has the lobbyists, the special interest groups, the 90 to 100,000 bureaucrats at the IRS. They're sort of this corrupt rectangle of interests in Washington. That's what we're going to have to overcome in order to get any type of tax reform.
All right. Jerry had a thought?
Comment. I do like to talk about General Electric. They have more lobbyists in Washington than anybody. The last that I heard, it's around 450. And it'd be interesting for all of you to check out how much they really pay in taxes. You'd be amazed.
I'd like to also ask, have you spoken to General Electric? Are they willing to buy into your system, or are they quite happy with the way the system is? Because there's a large benefit to corporations like that.
Yeah, of course, when I'm speaking to these lobbyists, they probably are actually, of course, their hostile reception was a reflection of their own desire to maintain their high salaries. The question is, if you went directly to the CEOs and CFOs and the tax departments, of course, the tax department might get shut down under tax reform, so maybe you wouldn't want to ask them. But if you went directly to the CEOs and CFOs and explained tax reform, I suspect you'd get a much, much friendlier reaction than you'd get from the tax lobbyists. Now, with General Electric, when you look at that data, because, of course, they're infamous for having a very low effective tax rate, some of it is because they're getting like these Solyndra-type corrupt credits from the green energy programs. I want to get rid of those. Some of it is because they have foreign source income, and in those numbers that people are quoting, they're not counting all the tax they're paying to foreign governments, and you should. So I'm as willing to bash GE as the next guy, but if we're not counting the fact, if we're going to count their foreign income, but then not count the tax they pay to foreign governments, that's a little bit unfair. We should have a territorial system, so those two things should wash out. If GE earns money in Brazil, Brazil should tax it, just like if Toyota earns money in the US should tax it, but we shouldn't have all this extraterritorial taxation going on.
Let me just add one just quick thing. You know, there are a lot of loopholes, and someone mentioned it up here. When I got up there, I never imagined how many loopholes. But let me just tell you, people from our community that come to see me, realtors, interest deduction would kill them because it would hurt a lot of people. Charitable giving. Sarasota has 700-800 nonprofits, has a lot of very large foundations. Charitable giving, they said, would kill them, ideally. So I'm just saying that there are a lot of people, and everybody has their niche in their own community. I met with a bunch of retailers the other day. They said, whatever you do, you can't, add another tax or, that type of thing. So my point in all saying this is that I think it got said earlier, if you go to a different taxing system, you got to look at all the loopholes and probably get rid of a lot of them, because we do have a corporate tax of 35%. But basically, I've heard a number between 13 and 17% they actually pay once you get through all the loopholes. So why not eliminate a lot of the loopholes in tax reform and bring down the taxes so you get a real number? Because when they brought up GE, a great company over a lot of years, but when they're making hundreds and hundreds of millions, and what I hear, they don't pay any tax, that doesn't seem right or fair. So I'll just say that.
Jerry wanted to jump in. I'll let him give his thought.
To bring it back, instead of talking about the big corporations, in terms of small businesses, which is what I represent, it's important to note that over 99% of all the businesses in the state of Florida, about 500,000 by the Small Business Administration standards, are small businesses. The typical small business is 3 to 4 employees. The average, when you put in some larger small businesses, is 15.3. All these businesses across the state are struggling underneath all kinds of regulations, Taxes are a big part of it. The tax burdens, accounting, keeping track of all this stuff is a huge, huge burden for anybody that has started and try to run a small business, no matter what field you're in. And I think that's what we need to focus on, and we're really appreciative of Congressman Buchanan to address this. It's very important for our economy and our future and our families, and for small businesses to be able to help their employees and also service their customers in our economy. So those are my comments.
Now,
Whether
let-
it's,
let me-
go ahead.
On the issue, the homeowners, the interest deduction on real estate that's a holy grail, charitable deductions. And I love people that come up to me and say, well, under the fair tax, what's going to happen to my interest deduction for interest on my mortgage? I said, tell you what, we'll give you a 100% deduction for interest on your mortgage. I mean, principal. You can deduct the principal on your mortgage from your income taxes. And they look at you and they, well, wait a minute. Excuse me. I don't have any income tax. Duh. So finally they get to understand that they don't have to worry about the home mortgage interest deduction. They're not paying any income tax. And on the charitable deduction thing, excuse me, is there a TB sanatorium in Sarah? It always kind of amuses me, the idea that somebody would not donate $10,000 to the local opera because I'm not going to give them $10,000 because then I won't be able to deduct $2,000 from my income tax. I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I've never been able to really make sense out of that train of economic thought.
I suspect a lot of people do give out of altruism, and you'd like to think that they do that, but I'm sure there are other people who do look at the tax angle when they think about giving to charity.
Then fine, then don't, give $8,000 and you're even.
But if you look at the data on charitable giving, all the academic research that's done out there, what you find is that two things overwhelmingly drive charitable giving over time: disposable income and net wealth. And if you do either a fair tax or a flat tax or any good tax reform, you're going to get more of those two things. Mm-hmm. And look at the 1980s. The 1980s was an experiment. In 1980, when Reagan took office, we had a top tax rate of 70%, which meant it only cost a rich person 30 cents to give $1 to charity. By the time Reagan left office, that top tax rate had come all the way down to 28%, which meant now it costs 72 cents to give $1 to charity. What happened to charitable giving in the 1980s? It skyrocketed. Why? Because people had more disposable income and net wealth. Yes, on the margin, people do look at their tax deduction, and that, it's part of the relative price, as we boring economists like to say. But the relative price, if it's completely swamped by big increases in disposable income and net wealth, you get more charitable giving. And that's why I think real, genuine, sweeping tax reform. Yes, there's no longer favoritism toward charities or home ownership, but because the overall economy is doing so much better, you would get more of those things. So I think real tax reform, nobody would have to worry in the real estate industry or the nonprofit industry, because we'd have a much, much more prosperous economy.
I wanted to ask Susan about that as well. If I know it right, WSRQ does take donations from people.
No, actually we don't. That's WSLR. We
I
are
beg your pardon.
Would you take one?
Oh, would I?
Yeah.
Sure. Neil, I used to carry you on my station.
I bet you regret that now.
Never. I was fully prepared for what I was going to be into. No, we actually are a for-profit radio station.
Okay, sorry, I had that one
That's
wrong.
okay.
You had a thought you were going to add, though, if I remember.
Oh, sure. Now you ask. I kind of want to go back to what Neil said about this prebate. And also, I think that's really more important, because as much as we sit up here and say this is what we should do, we shouldn't do, and it's all catered to these large corporations, they don't vote. I mean, they may influence the vote, but they don't vote. I think tax conversations should be about the people who depend on a living from week to week, not from year to year. And yes, we're talking about charitable contributions for those who can afford to give, but let's recognize all of the people who are the recipient of those charitable contributions and ask ourselves, what have we done? We're so quick to lump everybody in. In fact, we had a conversation earlier about 47%, 60%, whatever percentage you determine that doesn't pay into the system. And even Neil said that corporations don't pay taxes. I'd like you to tell that to the IRS, who I get statements on a regular basis about what I owe and what I have to pay into. My point is that you're going to have to do more than just paint a pretty picture. You're going to have to convince the voter that their paycheck is safe, that the money that they spend, that your philosophy of we're going to cover all your necessities, and then tell me what my necessities are. Tell me who determines what is a necessity to my life, and where does that begin? Because I'm not seeing any solutions, and you asked earlier, how are we going to implement it? I'd rather fix the current system that we have now, very much like Representative Buchanan pointed out, than just throw it all out and start over, because I'm not convinced that it's going to end up in a better place than it is now.
I wanted to ask as well, and this is actually a question we got from Elaine. What would keep the lobbyists in Congress from continuing to manipulate the tax code for favors and votes under the flat tax, or any meaningful reform that happened? Because back in 1986 there was reform, and then stuff got built on top of that. We do this, we make a wonderful reform of the system, and then stuff gets piled on top of it. What prevents that?
That's a great question. You clean out the stables, and horses tend to do their business. The stables get dirty again. What was it, Jefferson, who said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty? There's no guarantee. And that's why in my opening statement I said ultimately this is about the size of government. If government keeps growing and we become more like Greece and Italy and Spain, it's impossible to maintain a good tax system. And that I think is the #1 battle. And by the way, it's also, I said all during my remarks that I like the fair tax and flat tax. I see them as different sides of the same coin. The one reason why I actually favor the flat tax is precisely because I don't trust politicians. What's the worst thing that happens if you have a flat tax? You degenerate back to the current system. What's the worst thing that happens with a fair tax? The politicians pull a bait and switch on us. They put in a consumption tax, but they keep the income tax, and before you know it, you're France, and you have to train your army to surrender if there's ever a war. So the only way I would go with the fair tax, and by the way, as I said, I've testified in favor of this, is you have to not only repeal the 16th Amendment, you have to replace it with something so ironclad that even John Roberts and Ruth Bader Ginsburg can't say that an income tax is constitutional.
The fair tax... The fair tax would pass Congress with the provision that says this tax goes into effect on the first day of the year following the repeal of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. So you're absolutely right. 16th Amendment has to go. And by the way, how in the hell did we manage to talk enough states into ratifying the 16th Amendment? And you know how they did it? They did it by telling these states, the less populous, the poorer states, don't worry about this. The only people that are going to ever have to pay this income tax are rich people from New England anyway. So this is all a way for us to get our hands on money from these rich people in New England. And that got us the 16th Amendment. And we still have the income tax being used as the primary weapon of class warfare in this country today, and nobody has ever been able to do that better than the current occupier of the White House. He's an expert at it.
By the way, is anybody, if anybody is here from Delaware, you should be ashamed because your state was the one that ratified and put the income tax amendment over the top. So hang your head in shame if you're from Delaware.
There you go. Not enough to be the first state anymore. Dan mentioned the entitlement issue. And if we do tax reform and ultimately tax rates do come down, as many argue, how do you convince people who've come to expect the Medicare and the Social Security and all the things we ask the government to do for us that you're going to have to do without some of that stuff?
Well, don't forget, lower tax rates is not the same as lower tax revenue. I gave the example before about what happened to charitable contributions and the housing market in the 1980s, even though tax rates came down. Let me give you a different example about what happened with tax revenue. Reagan took office, top rate is 70%. According to the annual statistics of income from the IRS, the rich, those making over $200,000 in 1980, paid $19 billion to the IRS. So 70% tax rate, the rich paid $19 billion. Reagan brought the top tax rate all the way down to 28%. What happened to revenues from the rich? Did they go down to $8.5 billion, equivalent with the reduction in rates? Did revenue go down to $15 billion, meaning that the tax cut more than paid for itself in terms of 50% paid for itself? Did revenue stay at $19 billion? Did the tax cut pay for itself? Here's the class participation part. It's sort of like the Price is Right. How much revenue did those making over $200,000 a year pay in 1988? Do we have a guess? More. Well, come on. I need something specific. Doubled? Boy, what sort of crazy wild-eyed supply sider said that? In 1988, according to the IRS statistics of income, go to irs.gov if you want to, look it up yourself. In 1988, those making more than $200,000 a year, instead of paying $19 billion, they paid $99.7 billion. 5 times as much revenue at 28% as the government collected at 70%. Not only that, instead of 117,000 rich people, we had 724,000 rich people. We had more rich people, more taxable income, more revenue. Now, by the way, my goal is not to maximize revenue for the federal government, but it makes no sense at all to be on the wrong side of the Laffer curve and have tax rates so high that you're actually losing revenue. The only person I've ever heard endorse that was the person that Neil just mentioned, our current president, who said in a debate with Hillary Clinton in April 2008 that even if the capital gains tax rate was increased and it meant less revenue, he wanted to do it. That, to me, is a not only economically ludicrous, but a morally reprehensible statement.
He told Charlie Gibson, I think it was Gibson, said, look, the last time they raised capital gains taxes, revenue went down. And he whose name will not cross my lips said, well, I understand that, but we need to do it out of a sense of fairness. In other words, it just wasn't fair that those people could keep all that money and we had to take it away from them. After all, this is the guy that said, at some point you have to admit that you've made enough money.
Go ahead, Congressman.
Let me just say that the president, I think, has said it. I think everybody in Washington knows it. If they don't say it, Democrats or Republicans, I think they're being less than honest. You've got to deal with entitlements because at some point we're running $1.3 trillion deficits every year. The first year I got to was $130 billion. It's 10 times greater every year. We're going to go broke. Forget about the entitlements going forward. There's going to be no entitlements. At some point, you can't continue down this path. Anybody wants to look at the numbers, we're $16.5 trillion in debt. Quickly going to $20 trillion. Normally the cost of money over the last 30 years is 4 or 5%. It's $1 trillion in interest of taxpayers' money before you pay out one benefit. 49 out of 50 governors have a constitutional balance of budget amendment. That's what I've been pushing up there. It needs to get put in place at some point. I'd like to say yesterday, but even that process would take 7 or 8 years. And so everybody knows, the president on down, at least they might not want to admit it, they're worried about so much more about the next election than doing what's right. But the bottom line, we have running that deficit, we have 10 to 15,000 people a day, every day, for the next 30 years turning 65. And they all expect their benefits, Social Security, Medicare. If it doesn't get addressed, we're right behind Greece. There's no question. The difference is you can bail out Greece, but you can't bail out the U.S. So all these tax systems and everything we talk about, if we don't deal with this, you can forget about any tax system. We're not going to be around. I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist, and I look at some of these numbers going forward. It's scary. I mean, $16.5 trillion, and the only reason our interest rates are as low as they are, in my opinion, is because there's no transparency in China. We don't know what their books really look like. Japan and Europe has been flat. So financially, we're like the tallest midget in the world. So we can artificially keep the rates low, because if we raise interest rates 1 point, it costs us $170 billion in taxpayer money. So that's why entitlements, and I'm so passionate about this, because I think it's immoral what we're doing to our kids and our grandkids.
Well, you want to hear something really scary? The Bank for International Settlements, The Bank for International Settlements is a big money-clearing international bureaucracy in Switzerland measuring financial flows between countries. They did a study back in, I think it was July of 2011, and they measured what the debt would be in various developed countries by 2040, which is just 27 years from now. Greece is going to be at 300% of GDP, compared to what, about 140, 150% now. That sounds terrible. Guess where the U.S. is going to be if we just leave everything on autopilot? 450%. We're not going to be behind Greece. We're going to be ahead of Greece, ahead of them on the race to fiscal collapse. Because if we don't fix the entitlements, they're going to disappear. Our country will be economically destroyed. So I just want to say thank you for leading on that issue, because if we don't fix it, we're going to be worse than Greece, worse than Italy. The only country that was worse than us on that list was Japan. And boy, when they blow up, that's going to be nasty, because their demographics are really terrible.
We're getting close to the end of our time. A couple of people had asked basically the same question, and I know we've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I did want to ask Congressman Buchanan, what do you see as the main obstacle in the way of comprehensive tax reform?
Well, I'll just say, because a lot of people would say, the way we're configured in Congress, but I think there's a window of the next 6 months. It used to be the off year, historically, that you'd have time to get some real things done on a bipartisan basis. But unfortunately, when you run every 2 years, it seems like the next election's right upon you. But I do think there's a window of 6 months. And again, I'm going to take the president based on what he shared with me and others at a meeting at the Capitol about a week ago. He's not running again. He realizes he wants to try to do what's right. He wants to he knows we've got a problem with entitlements, but he said to deal with the entitlements, we got to deal with a tax reform. That's why I think there's an opportunity to deal with both. And I told the Speaker when I walked out of the meeting with him and others in our group, I said, we need to find out if there's an opportunity, a way to make a deal here that makes sense, because if we don't slow down entitlements, we're on the road to disaster. I don't know if it's 2 years, 5 years, or 8 years, but I remember October 2008, and it could be a lot worse than that. So I think there's a window of opportunity. A lot of people come up and say, Vern, you got to be kidding me. You tax increase at the end of the year. No, let's find and see if there's not an opportunity, because as I mentioned earlier on, Dave Camp had mentioned, they never thought they'd get welfare reform done. And he said they kept working at it, and they finally, everybody came to the realization. Everybody knows we need to deal with it, Democrat and Republican, but too many people are looking at the politics of the next election and not doing what's right for America, and we need to focus on what's right for America.
Now, the president has said he would consider entitlement reform, but he wants more revenue.
That's his version of tax reform, is raise taxes on the rich. When Obama says tax reform, oh my God, I mentioned his name. When he says tax reform, he means, I'm willing to consider entitlement reform, but only if we raise taxes more on the rich. That's his stance.
But isn't he saying that because the rich are getting an incredible amount of help from the government at this point? I mean, isn't it?
I know that the government certainly allowed me to retire and set me up to where I am today.
When we're talking, are you talking about the rich being in corporations, or are you talking about the individual? Because I think that's
corporations do not pay taxes and have no wealth. It's only all wealth is held by individuals. All wealth.
But they do pay taxes. They pay taxes even if it ends up at the end of the year to being a pass through to the stakeholders or the stockholders. They do pay taxes. It just depends on what bracket they fall into. But if you're talking about the individual, and it's wonderful that there's an invested interest in protecting the individual that make a large percentage of income, you're not going to sell that to the majority of the people in the United States who actually go out and vote. It's just not going to happen.
I know you're not, because look at what the media has done. Look what this guy in the White House.
Which you are a part of.
Well, I know, absolutely. But, this idea, Warren Buffett pays less taxes than his secretary. And the media completely and absolutely failed in their responsibility to go to the American people and say, the president may be right, but do bear in mind that we're talking about Warren Buffett's capital gains tax rate versus his secretary's income tax rate. And we really should point out that Warren Buffett's secretary pays exactly the same capital gains rate that Warren Buffett does
Yes.
on the same capital gains income, and Warren Buffett pays exactly the same income tax rate on the same taxable income that his secretary does. But the media wouldn't do that. They wouldn't play fair with the people. And we have a class warfare president up there who has divided the people on this "the rich need to pay their fair share" nonsense. And we haven't had enough activity in the media to dispel that asinine proposition and to show what the wealthy are really paying in this country.
Well, and what the media failed to what the media failed to cover on that whole issue with Warren Buffett is that when Warren Buffett is paying a 15% capital gains tax, that's not considering the fact that that income was also taxed by a 35% corporate income tax. So even before you get to that stage you were talking about, Neil, you had completely deceptive numbers, and Warren Buffett knows that. But I think Warren Buffett's playing the crony capitalist game. He's doing what we talked about GE doing, but he's doing it full time.
Well, the media knows it too, but they would not shoot straight with the American people because they have invested their entire reputation in this miracle of Barack Obama, and they are not going to do anything to tear that down because it'll make them look bad.
Okay.
What do you really think?
You know, I just wrote a book. Entitled, and it's out there, "Maybe I Should Just Shut Up and Go Away." Now you see why I gave it that title.
But be that all that as it may, if in the current situation, if anything's going to happen, it would require more revenue to get the reform on the entitlements, would it not? And can that happen?
Remember, when Obama says more revenue, he means raise taxes on the rich. When Dan says more revenue, he means create an economy where hard work is rewarded, and you'll see revenue go up.
Understood. But
I think they're looking at tax loopholes. What my interest is helping the people that create the jobs. You know, we've got a problem with debt and deficit. If we don't find a way to grow our economy from 2% to 5%, India and China's growing at 8%, you know, this is going to implode at some point. We need to help businesses be more successful and keep taxes low the best we can, especially on a lot of because they're the job providers. I'll just tell you this, in Manatee County, we have a chamber of 2,000 businesses. Sarasota County, I was chairman there, we have 2,000 businesses. Both of those chambers, most of those businesses are probably 20 employees or less, 90%. They need our help and support with less regulation, less frivolous lawsuits, and a simpler, flatter, fair tax. They create the jobs. And if we don't find a way to grow our economy, we're in a big-time trouble. And that's my point. That's why I want tax reform, is to help our small businesses, because we still have in this area maybe 8% unemployment. It was 5 years ago we were at 2 or 3%. We couldn't find workers. We need to get back where full employment, where people are making a good wage, and you do that, I think, by empowering businesses, and that's my mindset as it relates to smaller and medium-sized businesses.
now the president obviously doesn't see the urgency on the deficit. What do you give him to get what you want in return?
I think he does. I mean, he might not say it that way because he's got people that he's accountable to, or let's say people that, you know, in the Congress that feel differently. But I think, honestly, himself and everybody else realizes that we're going to go broke. And I don't think it's even 20 years. I think it's 2, 5, 8 years. Some point down the road, this is going to implode. You cannot, when you add $1 trillion in deficit each year, you can't even imagine that amount of money that our kids will never be able to pay back. If they don't understand that, then they shouldn't be in office.
I know we've run a little bit past noon. I know Jerry has got a thought, and so does Dan, so we'll let them get in, then we'll let Congressman give his final thoughts, and we'll let you get on to your lunch. Go
Just
ahead,
as
Jerry.
a follow-up to Congressman Buchanan, I've co-authored a book on the national debt. And to add on a little bit to what he said, if the interest rates return to normal around 6 to 7%, that alone will exceed the total tax collections that we have in the country today. If we keep piling up debt at the rate of $1 to $1.3 trillion over the next 5 years, and interest rates go up, it's very conceivable that the interest alone will exceed all tax collections and most, if not all, of the entitlements combined. My prediction is that this is not going to last any more than 5 years before we really have serious, serious problems in this country. I think Congressman Buchanan is on this. It's important. Other people have written books on this. At the John Ellison of the Cato Institute, who used to be chairman of the BB&T Bank, has written a book on it. The editor, the business editor, the economic editor of the Wall Street Journal has written it, and several other people have. Some of the books are very complex. Most people aren't going to read, but my prediction is that 5 years or less we will have extremely serious problems. So all these things tie together, and it's great that Congressman Buchanan is pursuing these to try to make some changes so we don't end up at where we don't want to be.
Yeah, and what Jerry's talking about is exactly what I was mentioning with that Bank for International Settlement study. In the long run, we are in deep trouble, but I'll add one thing to that. The problem isn't really our deficits and debt. That's the symptom. The problem is government getting too big. Whether they tax the money out of the private economy or borrow it out of the private economy, labor and capital are being misallocated. Our economy is growing weaker because government is spending too much of our economic output. But I want to close on an optimistic point that ties in with what Congressman Buchanan was saying. Who would have guessed right after the election that President Obama would sign a spending bill, as he just did, locking in the savings from the sequester? That was completely unpredictable. So forget about welfare reform, which was unpredictable, 13 years ago or whatever it was, or more. Just in the last 13 days, we had something unpredictable good that happened. So even though you look at Harry Reid in the Senate, you think, no, nothing good can happen. You look at what Obama's rhetoric has been, as Neil has talked about, you think, oh, nothing good can happen. But I'm glad there are people up in Washington trying to make something happen, because maybe, just maybe, lightning will strike and we don't have to wait 3.5 or 4 years before we actually begin to solve this problem. So thank you, Congressman.
And Congressman, let's get your closing thoughts.
Well, I'd just like to thank all of you out there, and we're moving forward on this process, and any input, any thoughts you have, let me know. I want to thank our panelists. But to me, tax reform is about more jobs and good paying jobs, and you get that through helping small businesses be more successful. My thought is if we remove the restrictors, we let the governors off and let businesses do what they do best, and that's to grow them and keep more of what they make and expand and use that money to expand and grow, will take care of a lot of the deficit and debt problem. It's not the only way to take care of it, but it'll start moving us in the right direction. We are a global economy. We've got to not only compete here, we've got to be able to compete abroad, and that's critical, and that's what I'm going to fight for every day. Thank you.
And I just want to offer one more thanks to our panelists, starting at the far end, Jerry Pierce, and then Susan Nylund, Dan Mitchell, and Neil Bortz. And thank you, Congressman Buchanan, for having this event. My name is John McQuiston from ABC7, and I thank you all for coming today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
And thank you, John.